So it's August, and we're starting a new sermon series entitled For Such a Time as This. In this series, we're going to explore the book of Esther. We're going to dive in, and we're going to explore all of the treasures that are found in this story. There are so many things that apply directly to our lives and to our time. I love the book of Esther. It is such a dramatic story. There's all kinds of twists and turns, and there's really interesting characters to dive into. Though I have to admit, what I love most about this book might be the part that's missing. Esther is the only book in the Bible where God is not specifically named. God is not mentioned, not even once. At the time of Esther, the Jews were in exile. Esther is living in Babylon, which is part of the powerful Persian Empire. And as God said that he would, God had seemingly turned his face away from his people. But even as God had gone seemingly silent, God is obviously at work in this story. God is not mentioned, and yet, this story is just dripping with God's divine providence. The main character in our story is Esther, an orphaned Jewish girl who'd been taken in by her cousin Mordecai after she had lost her parents. Esther is actually her Persian name, and it means star. I just love that. I love that because it seems like in the story of Esther, the stars just all aligned perfectly to set the stage for God's saving grace. So now, I'm just going to get everybody up to speed. So hang on. I'm going to give you the super speedy fast overview picture of the story of Esther. So hold on to your hats. The king is throwing a lavish party, and he requests that his king make an appearance so that everyone can admire her beauty. Queen Vashti refuses to appear before the king, and she is removed from her position. So, of course, the king needs a new queen, and this beautiful, exiled Jewish young woman who was hiding her Jewish identity, named Esther, catches his eye and wins his heart. Mordecai, Esther's cousin, learns of a plot to kill the king. And Esther relays that message to the king in Mordecai's name, saving the king's life. And the king is indebted to Mordecai. Haman, that arrogant, power-hungry second in command to the king, despises Mordecai because Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. And so Haman convinces the king to sign a decree to order the annihilation of all the Jews. On the night before Mordecai and the Jews are to be executed, the king suffers from insomnia. And so he reads the name of Mordecai in the book of memorable deeds, and he wants to honor Mordecai for his service. Esther bravely confronts the king and Haman and exposes the plan to kill the Jews and pleads for the king to save her people. Mordecai is honored, and he gets Haman's position. And Haman gets his just deserts and is executed in the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai. And God's people are once again saved from destruction. Whew. That is quite a story. God is never mentioned by name, but God's hand is obviously guiding things behind the scenes. God's divine providence is guaranteeing the deliverance of God's people, just as God had promised. For such a time as this. So the point we find ourselves in the story for today, in our scripture passage, Mordecai has learned of the plot to wipe the Jews completely out of the Persian Empire, which at the size of the Persian Empire at that time would have meant all the Jews on all the earth. Mordecai told Esther that she must go before the king, reveal her identity as a Jew, which she'd been keeping hiding at this point, and plead for the lives of her people. Esther was really scared to speak up. And that's really understandable because she's risking death in doing so. Going uninvited before the king is grounds for death, unless the king extends his golden scepter of approval toward you. As Esther was feeling so scared to act, Mordecai asked her to consider if possibly she was put in this position for such a time as this, particularly put there to speak on behalf of her people. He also warned Esther that she didn't have to step up, but if she didn't, God was going to find another way to save the Jews. But the safety and security of her life in the palace as queen couldn't save her from the consequences. Mordecai said that God was going to save the Jews, whether or not Esther was with him. But it would be much better for Esther and her family if she were. Though God is never mentioned specifically by name, Mordecai is talking about God's divine providence. So what exactly is providence? The word providence is defined as foreseeing care and guidance of God over the earth. God, especially when conceived as omnisciently directing the universe and the affairs of humankind with wise benevolence, a manifestation of divine care or direction. If we look at the origin of the word providence, we see that it stems from the Latin word providentia, pro meaning before or ahead of time, and videntia meaning to see. Providence means seeing ahead of time. So, here our invisible God is seeing ahead of time, steering things to the course of his will. God is constantly, continually, confidently at work in the world. I think that's pretty incredible. But now if you're like me, you start to wonder, well, where does free will fit into this picture of providence? I mean, we're Methodists after all. We believe in a sovereign God who willingly gives us the free will to decide for ourselves whether or not we're going to listen, whether or not we're going to follow. Are divine providence and free will mutually exclusive? How does free will fit into our understanding of God's providential sovereignty? Or in other words, does God put all of his eggs into our free will basket? I don't think so. No, of course not. If God did, how could we be assured that God would fulfill the promises? And we know that God is faithful. God is a God who keeps his promises. You may not be aware of where your pastors come from. I just showed up here on Ash Wednesday. In the candidacy process, as you're working towards licensing and ordination, it is a long, methodical process. They do not call us Methodists for nothing. All along the way, I've been asked to reflect and to write. I've been asked to answer questions about my call to ministry, my spiritual journey, God's working in my life. It is amazing to me in all of this, as I pull back and I consider the whole of it all, how much I see God's loving hand in my journey. God is not visible per se. Seemingly insignificant little things happen in my life. And yet when I write it all down and I consider each twist and turn, all of my gifts and my flaws, all of my obedient actions, and the times in which I've fallen short, times when I've been strong, and times when my weakness has threatened to take me down, When I consider the whole of the picture, I can see that God is all around. God is in there. You might consider doing a similar exercise. Now, I don't recommend the 5-hour psychological assessment that goes along with this if you don't have to. But really, I challenge you this week. Consider your life journey. Think about it, your spiritual journey. Where have you been? Where has God been? When have you felt the closest to God? When have you felt so far away that it scared you? This pulled back perspective can help you to see in your own life that even the times when it feels like God has gone silent, even when we think God is hidden, God is present in your story. Another thing that seems really interesting to me to ponder as I read the story of Esther is that the actions of the bad guys, not just the good guys, but the bad guys in this story really play an important role in God's plan. By working in opposition to God's plan, these bad guys put on display God's saving grace, God's love, God's redemption, God's might and power to overcome anything. In Romans 8:28, Paul says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." There is an overriding God, big picture story that will be accomplished as promised by our loving God, the details of which are open to free will. But rest assured, God wins. God keeps his promises. God gets his way for the good of those who love him in the end. And really, what a relief that is, to think all of my mistakes, all of my failings and my struggles to do what are right can all be used by God for his good. God does not give up on me. God will find a way to redeem it all. Actually, God has found a way, and it was in the plan all along. God's Son, Jesus Christ. As we talked about in the children's message today, where you stop the story really makes a big difference. A storyteller has a lot of power in that. I mean, imagine if the story of Cinderella stopped with her crying, locked away by her stepmother, and never reunited with her shoe or her prince. Or what if the story ended with a winded Rocky Balboa never being able to make it to the top of the stairs of the Philadelphia Art Museum? But fortunately, the story doesn't end there. Cinderella gets her prince, the Italian stallion drinks his raw egg, makes it to the top of the stairs, defeats Apollo Creed, and God wins in the end. End of story. Or at least for Rocky, until the next sequel. In all seriousness, there are all kinds of evidence of God using awful situations for his good in the Bible. In Genesis 45, we find Joseph greeting his brothers who had been jealous and sold him into slavery, and then lied to their father and said he was dead. Many years later, the brothers were scared to speak to Joseph because Joseph was now a very powerful, successful man in Egypt. In Genesis 45, 4-9, Joseph greets them and says, "Come near to me, please." And they came near. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in this land for 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry, go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry.'" If we'd stopped that story in the selling into slavery part, things would be pretty sad. That looked pretty bleak at that point. But as we read on, we can see that God redeemed Israel. God kept his promises that he made long ago, in part by using that evil act of bitter jealousy. Pharaoh's hardening of his heart to the pleas for freedom from the Hebrews by Moses set the stage for the magnificent display of God's mighty hand in the dramatic parting of the Red Sea, ushering the Hebrews to freedom. The hatred of the Pharisees for Jesus, resulting in the crucifixion of God's only Son, plays a crucial part in God's redemption of all humanity. And as Paul Harvey says, now you know the rest of the story. The household that I grew up in was always filled with lively political debate. Give us a good-spirited, friendly, often noisy debate, and it can be considered that a good time was had by all. Politics and religion are never off the table at our family gatherings. It never fails that at some point in the discussion, it turns into a time of sort of worried hand-wringing in the hell in a handbasket variety. But as I think about the story of Esther, and I consider God's providential hand in the working of things, God's hand on leaders, it makes me realize that this hand-wringing is for naught. The good, the bad, and the downright ugly, God redeems it all for the good of those who love God. Really, my only concern then should be loving God with all my heart and with all my soul and with all my strength and with all my mind. And just leave the rest to God. The rest is in God's hands, and I trust God way more than I trust myself to come through in the end. If I love God, God works for my good. It's a promise. The story ends well for Esther. She saves her people from destruction. She's a hero. But as we read on in the Bible or in history, we know that this is not the end of the troubles for her people. And it's not the end of the story for us either. There are many ups and downs, good times and bad to come. So where does our story end? As Christ was being crucified, his last words were, "It is finished." The end. Not the end of the story, but the end of slavery to sin, the end of death, the end of our severed relationship with God. Our daily story goes on. We celebrate joys and we struggle through rough patches. We go through long periods where it may seem like God is nowhere to be found at all. But we have the assurance in the resurrected Christ of how our story ends. Our story ends at the cross. It ends at that empty tomb. And in that end, we celebrate our glorious new beginning. Let us pray together.